In the late winter of 2018, the town of Ashwood, Virginia, carried its usual serene charm. A picture-perfect suburban community, it was a place where neighbors exchanged polite smiles on their morning walks, where children played on tree-lined streets, and where life seemed blissfully ordinary. But underneath this polished exterior lay a web of secrets, prejudice, and quiet resentments that festered in silence. It was in this unsuspecting setting that a violent tragedy unfolded, shaking the very foundation of the community. Ashwood wasn't just a town, it was a mirror reflecting decades of social divisions. Its streets were split not by fences or signs, but by invisible lines drawn by wealth, privilege, and unspoken biases. The affluent Ashwood Heights was a neighborhood of sprawling colonial homes and well-manicured lawns, the kind of place that projected success and comfort. On the other side of town lay Cedar Grove, a modest apartment complex where single mothers and working-class families fought to make ends meet. The residents of these two worlds rarely crossed paths, until they did, with devastating consequences. It was a bitterly cold day in March when Sophia James, a young mother living in Cedar Grove, made her way to Ashwood Market. Her coat, faded and fraying at the seams, barely shielded her from the icy wind as she clutched a near-empty wallet in her hand. Sophia had been laid off from her job as a medical receptionist 3 months earlier, and with 2 young children depending on her, the weight of her struggles grew heavier each day. Despite her efforts, bills piled up, and meals became smaller and less frequent. Inside the market, Sophia's desperation overwhelmed her. As she walked the aisles, her eyes darted from the shelves to the other shoppers. She tried to suppress the gnawing ache in her stomach, the same ache she knew her children were feeling back at home. With trembling hands, she slipped a can of soup and a small bag of rice into her worn-out purse. Her heart pounded with a mix of guilt and fear as she turned toward the exit, clutching the items she couldn't afford. But fate, cruel as it was, had other plans. Just as Sophia reached the store's entrance, she collided with Ethan Spencer. Ethan, a prominent contractor from Ashwood Heights, was known for his commanding presence and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Today, those eyes fell on Sophia, her face pale and her purse suspiciously bulging. A slow, smug smile crept across his lips as he realized what she'd done. For Ethan, this wasn't just about catching a shoplifter, it was an opportunity. He relished the look of panic that flashed in Sophia's eyes, the way her shoulders sagged under his gaze. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Looks like someone's having a rough day." Sophia stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please. I just needed." Her words trailed off, drowned by the suffocating shame she felt. Ethan's smile widened as he leaned in closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You know, I could call the police," he said, the threat lingering in the air. "But maybe there's another way we can handle this." In that moment, Sophia's world crumbled. She could see no way out, no escape from the man towering over her. And so, without knowing the true cost of her agreement, she nodded. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would tie their lives together in a deadly web of power, prejudice, and revenge. Ethan Spencer was a man who commanded attention. At 47 years old, he exuded an air of quiet authority that few dared to challenge. With broad shoulders and a posture that radiated confidence, he was the epitome of success in Ashwood. As the owner of a thriving construction business, Ethan had built not only homes but also a reputation as a hard-working, dependable man. Among his peers in the affluent neighborhood of Ashwood Heights, he was respected, admired, and even envied. But Ethan's carefully cultivated image masked a far darker reality, a smoldering bitterness that had shaped him since childhood. To those around him, he appeared to be the perfect husband to Emily, his soft-spoken wife who ran a boutique floral shop in town. Their marriage, from the outside, seemed like the portrait of suburban bliss. But behind closed doors, Ethan's world was fractured, his heart hardened by a past he refused to confront. As a boy, Ethan had been close to his mother, Margaret Spencer. She was a strong, resilient woman who had single-handedly raised him after his father walked out of their lives. Margaret had worked tirelessly to provide for her son, taking on long hours as a secretary to ensure he never went without. To Ethan, she was more than a parent, she was his anchor, his guide, and his hero. That anchor was violently severed when Ethan was just 12 years old. On a humid summer evening, their home in Ashwood Heights was engulfed in flames. The fire began in the laundry room, spreading quickly and trapping Margaret inside. By the time firefighters arrived, it was too late. The official investigation ruled it an accident. A faulty electrical outlet was to blame. But rumors swirled in the aftermath, pointing fingers at Miss Marcia, the family's black housekeeper, who had been in the laundry room earlier that day. Marcia was never charged, but for young Ethan, suspicion was enough. His grief twisted into anger, and that anger took root as hatred. To him, Marcia had taken his mother and escaped justice. It was a belief he carried into adulthood, quietly poisoning his interactions with anyone who reminded him of her. Over the years, Ethan built walls, not just the physical ones of his profession, but emotional barriers that separated him from empathy, trust, and understanding. Emily had entered Ethan's life when he was in his mid-20s. Sweet-natured and hopeful, she saw in Ethan a man with ambition and a strong sense of purpose. What she couldn't see were the scars he kept hidden, the cracks in his foundation that no amount of love or support could repair. Ethan kept his darker side carefully concealed, shielding Emily from the full extent of his resentment. She knew he had a temper and that he avoided conversations about his past, but she chalked it up to the burdens of his childhood. In truth, Ethan's bitterness only deepened with time, feeding a need for control and superiority. In his professional life, Ethan thrived on power. He relished being the one others depended on, the one who made decisions that shaped their lives. Whether it was an employee, a client, or a neighbor, Ethan sought moments where he could assert his dominance. It wasn't enough to succeed, he needed others to know it, to feel it. And when those moments came at the expense of someone he deemed lesser, it brought him an almost perverse satisfaction. It was this craving for control that drew Ethan to Sophia James. When he caught her shoplifting at Ashwood Market, it was as though the stars had aligned to hand him the perfect opportunity. Here was a woman who fit every prejudice he harbored, struggling, vulnerable, and, in his eyes, undeserving of sympathy. The power dynamic was clear, and Ethan seized it without hesitation. Beneath Ethan's polished exterior lay a storm of unspoken rage, resentment, and entitlement. He was a man who wore his respectability like armor, but the cracks in that armor were widening. And though the people of Ashwood Heights saw him as a pillar of their community, they didn't see the shadows lurking just beneath the surface. Ethan's life was a balancing act, a careful construction of lies and half-truths. But as events unfolded, the foundation of that life would be tested, and the facade he had so meticulously built would begin to crumble. Sophia James was the kind of woman whose resilience often went unnoticed. At 32, her life had become a daily battle for survival, a delicate balancing act between providing for her two young children and keeping her own spirit from breaking. Living in the modest Cedar Grove apartments on the outskirts of Ashwood, Virginia, Sophia's reality was far removed from the manicured perfection of Ashwood Heights. While some saw her as a struggling single mother, Sophia saw herself as a fighter, even when the odds felt impossibly stacked against her. Life hadn't always been so unforgiving. Just a few years earlier, Sophia had been married to Daniel, the love of her life and father of her children, Liam and Grace. Daniel had been a kind man, full of ambition, and together they dreamed of building a stable future. But in 2015, everything changed. A late-night car accident on a rain-slicked highway took Daniel from her, leaving Sophia a widow at just 29. The grief was suffocating, but Sophia didn't have the luxury of falling apart, not with two children depending on her. For the next few years, Sophia threw herself into work, taking a job as a medical receptionist at a small clinic in Ashwood. The pay wasn't much, but it kept food on the table and a roof over their heads. She became a master of stretching every dollar, learning to make the most of what little she had. But in January 2018, another blow landed. The clinic where Sophia worked shut down unexpectedly, leaving her unemployed and scrambling to make ends meet. As the weeks turned into months, the pressure mounted. The rent for their tiny two-bedroom apartment loomed large, and utility bills piled up faster than Sophia could keep track of them. Nights were the hardest. When Liam, 8, and Grace, 5, were finally asleep, Sophia would sit in the dim light of their kitchen, staring at a stack of overdue notices and wondering how she could possibly give them the life they deserved. Sophia wasn't one to ask for help, even when she needed it most. Pride kept her from reaching out to the community resources available in Ashwood. She feared the judgmental stares of the town's more affluent residents, who already looked down on Cedar Grove as a haven for trouble. Instead, she bore her burdens in silence, doing everything she could to shield her children from the harshness of their reality. For Liam and Grace, Sophia was their anchor. Despite her struggles, she made sure they never went to bed without a story or woke up without a kiss on the forehead. She wanted them to feel safe, loved, and protected, even as her own world teetered on the brink of collapse. But the toll it took on her was undeniable. Each day felt heavier than the last, and Sophia's once bright smile had dimmed to a shadow of its former self. It was in this state, desperate, exhausted, and out of options, that Sophia walked into Ashwood Market on that cold March day. Her intention wasn't to steal, it was to find something affordable, something small to bring home to her children. But as she wandered the aisles, her empty wallet felt like an anchor dragging her deeper into despair. The thought of her children going hungry that night gnawed at her insides until she made a decision she never thought she'd have to make. With trembling hands, Sophia slipped a can of soup and a small bag of rice into her purse. Her heart raced as she walked toward the exit, guilt and fear clawing at her in equal measure. She told herself it was just this once, that it was for Liam and Grace, that it was necessary. But her thoughts were cut short as she collided with a man standing near the door, a man whose sharp gaze and smug smile made her blood run cold. Ethan Spencer. From the moment their eyes met, Sophia knew her life was about to take a turn. She saw the judgment in his eyes, the way his lips curled into a satisfied smirk. When he spoke, his words were laced with a condescension that made her stomach churn. Well, he drawled. Looks like someone's in over their head. Sophia stammered, trying to explain herself, but the words caught in her throat. Ethan didn't need to hear her excuses. To him, she was nothing more than an opportunity, a pawn he could manipulate. As he leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a whisper, he uttered the words that would set everything in motion. You don't want me to call the police, do you? Maybe there's another way we can handle this. In that moment, Sophia's world narrowed to the man standing before her. The life she had worked so hard to hold together now felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She had no choice but to nod, unknowingly stepping into a nightmare she couldn't escape. The moment Sophia agreed to Ethan's terms, she unknowingly opened the door to a torment that would erode her spirit and reshape her life. What began as a desperate attempt to avoid a criminal charge quickly spiraled into a nightmare of control, degradation, and fear. For Ethan Spencer, this wasn't just about punishing Sophia for shoplifting, it was about asserting dominance, relishing the power he held over someone he deemed inferior. For Sophia, it was the beginning of a struggle to survive, not just for herself, but for the two children who depended on her. At first, Ethan's demands were sporadic. A phone call late at night instructing her to meet him at an abandoned lot near Ashwood Market. A text message in the middle of her frantic job hunt, summoning her to the rundown Pinewood Motel on the edge of town. Each time, Sophia would brace herself for the humiliation that awaited her. Ethan made no effort to hide his disdain, sneering as he reminded her of her place. You should be grateful, he said during one meeting, his voice dripping with condescension. Most people wouldn't give you a second chance. But I'm not like most people. Sophia's stomach churned at his words, but she bit her tongue, knowing she had no choice. The alternative, police involvement, public shame, losing custody of Liam and Grace, was unthinkable. Ethan knew this, and he used it to tighten his grip on her, wielding her fear like a weapon. What made Ethan's manipulation even more insidious was the unpredictability of his actions. Days, sometimes weeks, would pass without contact, giving Sophia a brief illusion of normalcy. She would start to believe that perhaps it was over, that Ethan had finally grown bored. But just as she began to catch her breath, his voice would crackle through her phone, summoning her once again. Each encounter left Sophia feeling smaller, more broken. Ethan's words were as cutting as his actions. He mocked her financial struggles, her role as a single mother, and even her love for her children. "Do you really think you're a good mother?" he taunted one evening. "Stealing to feed your kids? Pathetic." Sophia clenched her fists, willing herself not to cry in front of him. She couldn't give him the satisfaction. But his words cut deep, planting seeds of doubt that took root in her already fragile self-esteem. She began to second-guess every decision she made, questioning whether she was truly capable of protecting her family. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan grew bolder, pushing Sophia further with each demand. He seemed to take pleasure in testing her limits, watching how far she would go to shield her children from the truth. What started as veiled threats became outright commands, each one more degrading than the last. Sophia felt like a puppet on strings, forced to dance to his every whim while desperately trying to preserve some semblance of dignity. But even in her darkest moments, Sophia found strength in her love for Liam and Grace. They were her anchor, her reason for enduring the torment Ethan inflicted on her. At night, after tucking them into bed, she would sit alone in the silence of her apartment, tears streaming down her face as she tried to plan a way out. She couldn't let Ethan win, she wouldn't. What Sophia didn't know was that Ethan's need for control wasn't just about her. It was rooted in something far deeper, a rage that had festered in him for decades. To Ethan, Sophia wasn't just a struggling single mother. She was a symbol of everything he despised, everything he blamed for the pain and loss he had carried since childhood. Every sneer, every degrading comment, was his way of reclaiming the power he felt had been stolen from him. Yet, even as Ethan tightened his grip, cracks began to form in his facade. He underestimated Sophia's resilience, the quiet strength that simmered beneath her fear. And while he saw her as a pawn in his game, Sophia was quietly gathering the courage to fight back. Each encounter, though brutal, served as a reminder of what was at stake. She couldn't let Ethan destroy her, not for her sake, but for Liam and Grace. As summer turned to fall, Sophia's resolve began to harden. The torment wasn't breaking her, it was transforming her. She was no longer the desperate woman Ethan had caught in Ashwood Market. She was something far more dangerous, a mother determined to protect her children, no matter the cost. And though she hadn't yet realized it, the balance of power between them was beginning to shift. By the time fall arrived, Sophia James was no longer the same woman who had trembled under Ethan Spencer's threats. Months of enduring his degradation had chipped away at her spirit, but in the cracks, a new strength was beginning to emerge. The torment hadn't broken her, it had awakened something within her, a quiet determination to reclaim her life and protect her children from the shadow Ethan cast over them. The turning point came one evening in early October. Ethan had summoned Sophia to the Pinewood Motel yet again, his tone in the message colder and more commanding than ever. As she sat on the edge of the motel bed, enduring another tirade of belittling remarks, something inside her shifted. Ethan's words, which once cut her to the core, now felt like echoes, hollow and meaningless. She stared at him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, and for the first time, she wasn't consumed by fear, she was consumed by resolve. That night, as Ethan ranted about her supposed incompetence as a mother, Sophia slipped her hand into her pocket and pressed the record button on her phone. She held it steady, hidden from view, as Ethan's venomous words spilled out. He spoke of her like she was nothing, a disposable pawn in his twisted game. He even ridiculed his wife, Emily, calling her weak and inadequate, a failure in his eyes. Sophia listened in silence, her heart pounding with a mix of defiance and dread. Every insult he hurled, every word laced with venom, became a weapon she could use against him. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sophia felt like she had some semblance of control. She wasn't just enduring his abuse anymore, she was documenting it, building a case that could expose the monster Ethan truly was. When she returned home that night, Sophia sat in the dim light of her kitchen, replaying the recording on her phone. Ethan's voice filled the room, dripping with arrogance and disdain. She flinched at the sound, her hands trembling, but she forced herself to listen. Each word reminded her of the humiliation she had endured, but it also fueled her growing determination. For the first time, she saw a way out. At first, Sophia considered taking the recording to the police. She imagined walking into the station, presenting her evidence, and finally ending the nightmare. But doubt crept in. What if Ethan's connections in the community shielded him? What if no one believed her? The thought of Liam and Grace being dragged into a public scandal made her stomach churn. She needed another plan, something quieter, but just as powerful. Her thoughts turned to Emily Spencer, the woman Ethan had so casually disparaged during his tirade. Sophia didn't know much about Emily, but she knew enough to recognize that Emily, too, was a victim of Ethan's cruelty. The things Ethan had said about his wife were unforgivable, and Sophia felt a pang of empathy for the woman who had likely endured years of manipulation and emotional abuse. Emily deserved to know the truth about the man she had married. In the days that followed, Sophia's resolve hardened. She spent her evenings crafting an email to Emily, attaching the recording and typing out a simple message: "You deserve to know the truth. This is who your husband really is." She agonized over every word, torn between guilt and conviction. Sophia knew this decision would shatter Emily's world, but she also believed it was the only way to bring Ethan's reign of terror to an end. On a cold October night, Sophia hit send. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen as her heart pounded in her chest. For the first time in months, she felt something close to relief. The recording was out of her hands now, a ticking time bomb in Ethan's carefully constructed life. She didn't know how Emily would respond, but she knew that the truth was finally out there. The next morning, as Sophia walked Liam and Grace to school, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The sky was gray, and the air carried the crisp bite of autumn, but for the first time in a long time, Sophia felt like she could breathe. She didn't have all the answers, and she knew the fight wasn't over, but she had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life. Sophia was no longer a victim. She was no longer just a desperate mother trying to survive. She was a force, driven by the love for her children and a newfound determination to dismantle the power Ethan held over her. And though she didn't know what lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain: Ethan Spencer's control over her was beginning to slip, and she wouldn't stop until she was free. Emily Spencer had always been proud of her role as the devoted wife of Ethan Spencer. To the outside world, theirs was a picture-perfect marriage: she, the kind and soft-spoken florist, and Ethan, the ambitious and respected contractor. Their home in Ashwood Heights stood as a symbol of their success, its pristine facade mirroring the image of their life together. But Emily's reality had always been far more complicated. For years, Emily had sensed something darker lurking beneath Ethan's composed exterior. He was a man of routine, of control, and of unspoken rules that she had learned not to question. Ethan rarely shared his thoughts or feelings, brushing aside any attempts she made to discuss his past. When his temper occasionally flared, she would excuse it as the pressure of his work or the weight of his responsibilities. Deep down, though, Emily knew there were parts of her husband she would never truly understand. On an unseasonably cold evening in October 2018, Emily's world began to unravel. She was sitting at the kitchen counter, sipping her usual evening cup of chamomile tea, when her phone buzzed with a new email notification. She didn't recognize the sender, and the subject line was chilling in its simplicity: "You deserve to know the truth." Curious but apprehensive, Emily opened the email. Attached was an audio recording, along with a single line of text: "This is who your husband really is." Her heart raced as she hesitated, staring at the attachment. A part of her didn't want to know. But another part, the part that had always questioned Ethan's occasional absences and his quiet contempt for others, compelled her to press play. The moment Ethan's voice filled the room, Emily froze. The man she had known for over 2 decades sounded cold, cruel, and utterly unrecognizable. She listened in stunned silence as he belittled a woman she didn't know, mocking her desperation and vulnerability. His words dripped with venom, each one more degrading than the last. As the recording continued, Ethan's disdain turned toward Emily herself. He described her as weak, useless, and inadequate, a woman who had failed to live up to his expectations. Emily's hands trembled, the phone slipping slightly from her grasp. The insult stung, piercing her heart like shards of glass. But more than the pain of his words was the realization that she had been living with a stranger. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment or a moment of anger. This was who Ethan truly was, a man capable of unimaginable cruelty. As the recording played on, Emily pieced together the story of Ethan's connection to the woman in the recording, Sophia James. It didn't take long for her to understand what had been happening. The meetings, the manipulation, the abuse, it all painted a picture of a man who thrived on control and dominance, no matter the cost to others. Her stomach churned as the full scope of his actions became clear. When the recording ended, Emily sat in stunned silence. The house, usually a place of warmth and familiarity, now felt cold and alien. She replayed the recording in her mind, each word echoing with brutal clarity. How could she have been so blind? How could she have shared her life with someone capable of such cruelty? Emily spent the rest of the night pacing the kitchen, her mind racing with questions and emotions she couldn't contain. Anger, betrayal, shame, they all swirled within her, leaving her on the verge of collapse. By the time the sun began to rise, Emily knew she couldn't stay silent. She couldn't continue pretending that the man she loved was anything but a monster. That morning, Emily made the decision to leave. She packed a suitcase with only the essentials, her movements quiet and deliberate. Every step felt like a betrayal of the life she had built, but she knew that staying was no longer an option. Before she left, Emily sat at the dining table and wrote a short note, her hands shaking as she placed it on the kitchen counter. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of her heartbreak. "I know what you've done. I can't be a part of this anymore. Don't try to find me." As Emily walked out the door, the crisp autumn air bit at her skin, but she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. She didn't have a plan yet, but she knew she was finally free from Ethan's shadow. What she didn't know was that her departure would set off a chain of events that would bring Ethan's carefully constructed world crashing down. For Ethan, coming home to an empty house and Emily's note was a blow he hadn't anticipated. Anger surged within him, a storm of humiliation and rage that demanded an outlet. And in his twisted mind, there was only one person to blame for his unraveling: Sophia James. The air was bitterly cold on the evening of December 12, 2018. Sophia James had just finished her shift at the small diner where she'd recently found work, grateful for the few extra dollars that would go toward feeding her children. The streets of Ashwood were eerily quiet, the wind howling through the empty roads as she pulled her coat tighter around her and began the walk home. She thought about Liam and Grace, waiting for her at the apartment, and quickened her pace, eager to escape the chill. But as she turned onto Elmwood Street, a sense of unease crept over her. The flickering streetlights cast long, shifting shadows, and Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, her breath visible in the icy air, but saw nothing. Still, her instincts screamed at her to move faster. Her footsteps quickened, echoing loudly against the pavement. From the darkness, Ethan Spencer emerged. He stepped out of the shadows with a calmness that belied the storm raging within him. His face was contorted in fury, his eyes dark and unyielding as they locked onto Sophia. She froze, her heart pounding as she took a step back. The man before her wasn't just angry, he was consumed by a seething rage that sent a chill down her spine. "You think you've won, don't you?" Ethan's voice was low, almost a growl. "Sending that recording to Emily? Ruining my life? You had no right." Sophia's mind raced, fear pulsing through her veins as she tried to maintain her composure. "I didn't ruin your life," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "You did that yourself." Ethan's jaw tightened, his expression twisting into something almost feral. "You have no idea what you've done," he spat, taking a menacing step toward her. "Do you think you're better than me? Smarter? You're nothing. Nothing." Sophia took another step back, her pulse hammering in her ears. She knew she was in danger. Ethan's anger wasn't just words anymore, it was a tangible force, radiating off him like heat. She needed to get away, but his presence loomed large, blocking her path. "Stay away from me," she said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her. "You don't control me anymore." That was the breaking point. Ethan lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a force that nearly knocked her off her feet. His grip was bruising, his fingers digging into her skin as he dragged her into a narrow alleyway. Sophia struggled, her instincts kicking in as she clawed at his hand, but Ethan's strength was overwhelming. The dim light from a distant street lamp cast eerie shadows around them, amplifying the tension. "You don't get to walk away from this," Ethan hissed, his face inches from hers. "You think you can humiliate me? Destroy my family? There's a price for that." Sophia's mind raced as she fought against him, her desperation giving her strength she didn't know she had. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls of the alley. She twisted and kicked, her survival instincts taking over. Memories of Liam and Grace flashed through her mind, she had to survive, for them. In the chaos of their struggle, Ethan's footing faltered. The uneven ground beneath him shifted as he stumbled backward, his balance slipping. Sophia seized the opportunity, pushing against him with all her might. Ethan staggered, his heel catching on a loose brick. For a split second, his eyes widened in shock as the momentum carried him into the wall behind him. Above them, a large, dislodged brick teetered precariously on the edge of the building. The impact of Ethan's fall sent vibrations through the structure, and in an instant, the brick tumbled down. It struck Ethan squarely on the head with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the ground, motionless. Sophia froze, her chest heaving as she tried to process what had just happened. The alley was silent now, save for the sound of her ragged breathing. She stared at Ethan's lifeless form, a mix of shock, relief, and sadness washing over her. She was alive. She had survived. But the weight of what had transpired pressed down on her, leaving her trembling. With shaking hands, Sophia reached for her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was steady, despite the turmoil inside her, as she reported the incident. Minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the air, red and blue lights illuminating the dark alley. Police officers approached cautiously, assessing the scene as Sophia recounted everything that had happened. One officer noticed a surveillance camera mounted on the building at the edge of the alley. The footage, once reviewed, confirmed Sophia's account in chilling detail: Ethan's aggression, their struggle, and the accident that led to his death. The evidence was undeniable. As the officers escorted her away from the scene, Sophia felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. The nightmare was over. Ethan's control, his hatred, his cruelty, they were finally behind her. But as she thought of Liam and Grace waiting for her at home, Sophia realized the fight hadn't been just for her survival. It had been for them, too. And though the scars of the ordeal would linger, she knew she had reclaimed her power, and her freedom. The investigation into Ethan Spencer's death concluded swiftly. The surveillance footage from the alley made it clear, Sophia James had acted in self-defense. By March 2019, the case was officially closed, with the authorities determining that Ethan's death, while tragic, was the result of his own aggression and Sophia's desperate struggle to survive. The ruling brought Sophia a sense of closure, but it couldn't erase the scars left by months of torment. In the days following Ethan's death, Ashwood, Virginia, was a town in shock. The residents of Ashwood Heights, who had long admired Ethan as a successful businessman and upstanding member of the community, were forced to confront the truth about the man they thought they knew. Whispers of his secret hatred and abusive tendencies rippled through the town, leaving many grappling with their own complicity in ignoring the signs. For Sophia, the end of the investigation marked the beginning of a new chapter. The weight of Ethan's control was finally gone, but the journey to rebuild her life was only just beginning. Returning to her small apartment in Cedar Grove, Sophia focused her energy on the two people who mattered most, Liam and Grace. Every morning, she woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to create a better future for her children. The pain of her ordeal remained, but it became a source of strength rather than despair. Sophia had faced the worst and survived. She wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter. Emily Spencer, too, found herself at a crossroads. In the wake of Ethan's death, she quietly left Ashwood Heights, seeking refuge in a new town where she could start fresh. For years, Emily had lived under Ethan's shadow, unaware of the full extent of his cruelty. The revelations about her husband's actions were devastating, but they also brought a sense of liberation. No longer tethered to a life of deception, Emily began the slow process of rediscovering who she was. She left behind the grand house and the image of a perfect marriage, choosing instead a modest but peaceful existence where she could heal and move forward. Back in Ashwood, the community began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. Ethan's death and the events surrounding it sparked difficult conversations about prejudice, power, and the impact of unchecked hatred. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to the struggles of Cedar Grove began reaching out, recognizing the need for unity in a town long divided by invisible lines. While the scars of the tragedy lingered, they also served as a stark reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding. As for Sophia, she emerged from the ordeal stronger than ever. Her quiet resilience became a source of inspiration for those around her, a testament to the strength of a mother's love and the power of standing up against injustice. Though the road ahead was uncertain, Sophia faced it with her head held high, knowing that she had reclaimed her life and her dignity. Sophia's journey is one of survival, resilience, and the fight to protect what matters most. But her story also raises important questions about the invisible battles many face in their lives. What do you think of Sophia's transformation throughout the story? How do you feel about Emily's decision to leave her life behind and start over? Do you think the community of Ashwood could have done more to prevent such a tragedy? What lessons do you take away from this story about empathy, courage, and standing up against injustice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this gripping tale of resilience and redemption. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that reveal the hidden battles behind closed doors. See you in the next case.